Hey there. Welcome to the More Miles podcast. I'm Lauren.
I'm Michelle.
And I'm Scott.
And we are the More Miles Run Coaching team. Okay, today we are talking about training. For lack of a better title, that what I want to call this episode is When Shit Hits the Fan. I'm sure by the time we upload the episode, I'll have a better title picked out for this. But we want to talk about training in a general sense, but what happens when your training doesn't go as planned? I think most people who are listening to this podcast are training for something. You're training for your first 5K, for a marathon, for an ultra marathon. You have a plan of how you're going to get there from when you started to when the race is. I think the first thing we wanted to make sure to touch on upfront is that training never goes perfectly. There is no such thing as a perfect training cycle. And Scott and Michelle, I'm sure you can speak to this too as athletes and as coaches, that when you're looking at a cycle of training, you are always going to have, you might get sick in there. You might have a bad workout or a couple of bad workouts. You might have a day that you can't get a run in because your schedule or something comes up. I don't know. Am I right? Do you guys see that often, both with yourselves and with your athletes?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
or a combination of all the above.
Right. I sort of remind people, like, if your training does go perfectly, maybe you're not doing it right. Like, there's a lot of life that happens. We're training for this one day, but you might spend 3 months, 4 months, 5 months training for that one single event. And that's a lot of life. It's a lot of your time invested. So if you are looking at your training and you've missed a day or you've had a subpar workout or something like that, just know that that's normal and it's expected even. Just so you know, there's no such thing as a perfect training cycle. It doesn't exist. So let's get into that though. So what we want to talk about is not, the one-off bad workout or the single day that you had to miss. We want to talk about sort of in a larger sense. What kind of things commonly can derail your training cycle? That's maybe in a bigger sense. Maybe you miss a couple days, maybe you miss a week or 2 weeks or something like that. What are the common things that you guys see that can derail an athlete?
Well,
Yes.
I've got a list of probably. You want me to go, Michelle?
No, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. I was going to say you and I are probably on the same page in terms of, like, there's a host of things. There's a laundry list of things. I think probably the number one, the obvious thing that most athletes would point to and think that this is going to derail me would be an injury. Whether that's a minor injury or a major injury, whether it's a stub toe or a surgery, anything in between. I think maybe we can start there. I think that's probably the hot topic of what people think will derail them.
For sure. I think that's an important part to emphasize when you mention the significance of an injury. Something like a surgery, unplanned. Let's say you have your appendix taken out or something like that. That's obviously a bigger deal. But a lot of running related injuries, I think it's important to note, are they almost always start minor, unless you have taken a fall or something like that, where you have, fallen and broken something. An injury is usually a gradual thing that comes on. The common thing that we hear is your body whispers to you before it yells. There's usually little signs, little things. I think it's also really common that runners push through that. We're pretty uncomfortable or comfortable with discomfort. And so knowing, what's normal, what's not normal, I think we tend to take those little niggles and ignore them, or maybe push them longer than they need to be. But it's important to note that running injuries like that are usually minor if you address them up front. They can become major for sure if you ignore them, but there is so much that we can do for a little thing before it gets major. So, like, what kind of things, let's say someone has a little thing that's creeping in, what kind of stuff can we be doing as the athlete to address those things?
I think first is just being open with the communication. As a coach, I really like to ask the simple question, how do you feel? I could just ask that at the end of the week or at the beginning of the week to just get an indication of how do they feel. And I think from an athlete perspective, you just have to be open and honest. And everything from just saying, my legs are really sore. I just ran X amount of miles last week. It was a peak week, or I had the longest run I've ever done, or I just got done running 20 miles in the middle of a hurricane. I feel like crap. That can spark a conversation, right? Athlete and coach conversation on, well, let's talk about that. Do your legs feel like crap because of the volume? Where's the pain at? Is it in your knee? Is it in your quad? Is it in your, what's going on? And I think just starting there of being open is a good starting point, because so many athletes, and I've been victim of this so many times, of not wanting to tell you that, hey, my foot hurts. It took me a while to tell you my foot hurt, but it turned out to not really be that big of an injury. And all that took was just open communication. It just took me willing to tell coach, hey, it hurts, right? And I think that's hard sometimes for athletes to just open up and say, I'm struggling, I'm sore, I'm tired. Maybe they feel like we're going to lower their volume or whatever the case may be. But I think that's probably the greatest starting point, is just to be open with the communication.
Yeah, and I think there's also, coaches can help you decipher if it's something you need to go get checked out for versus, is it something that we just need to stretch, foam roll? Is it normal run tightness? Even though ourselves, we sometimes misdiagnose ourselves in that, thinking it's just typical run pain. But there are times where, if you have like a sharp pain, that's typically not a normal running, like my long run hurt. It's, there might be something more going on. And there's a point where I think you need to say, like, okay, we need to get you to a PT or a doctor or some imaging to figure out what's going on. And again, the sooner you get that done, the sooner you can treat it properly and move on. So I think that constant communication is key, and also reacting quickly. Don't be afraid we're going to take miles from you. I know that's my fear, is I don't want my miles going away, but that's going to keep you going in the long run versus a week or so.
And I think maybe some of the fear that athletes may have, I've felt this, I'm going to use myself in this example again, is that, hey, if I really admit that this is going on and it turns out I have to go see somebody and it turns out it's an injury, I may not be able to run my race, right? And so even though that doesn't make any sense when I say that, I think that's natural to kind of in your head feel like if I don't say anything, maybe it'll just go away. So we're talking about, it could not be an injury. Maybe it's a short thing. And even if it is an injury, depending on where you are in the cycle with your goal race, it may not derail you that much. One day, 1 week, 1 month, even depending on where you are, may not be that big of a deal.
I think you both made really great points there in being willing to be open and honest, whether that is even with yourself or with your coach. And I think that in a newer coach-athlete relationship, sometimes that's hard. You feel like you guys both mentioned, like, you want to protect your training, and sometimes that comes at the expense of the goal that you're working so hard for. You don't want your training taken away, or you don't want it adjusted, or you feel performative for your coach. You want to show your coach how well you're doing, how well you're responding, and sometimes we don't want to share that there's a hiccup. So I think that's a really important point that you both made, is being open and honest about what's happening so that it can be addressed faster, and always taking 1 or 2 days of rest or of recovery or adjustment, or altering your strength routine, altering your foam rolling routine, nailing into something specific is so much more worth it than having to take months because you ignored it for too long, or you can't get to your goal race or complete the goal that you were working toward because you ignored this for so long and it turned into a bigger issue. So yeah, being open and honest and willing to admit to yourself when there's a problem, or if you're not even sure that it's a problem, being willing to talk that through with your coach and let them help you figure out what the path is and what the issue is. Okay, injuries are probably number one in endurance sport, the thing that people worry about, and something that we see periodically. So what else? Like, there's so many things that can come into play in a training cycle. What other things do you guys see that can alter or derail a training plan?
Yeah, so illness, especially this time of year. I feel like the fall races is really where that kind of starts to hit, when school is back in session and like all the things start swirling around. But illness will really play a part. And again, it depends. I think that depends. on, how much it affects you depends on how quickly you recover from the illness, what the illness is. I mean, you have everything from a cold to COVID to flu to, even pneumonia. Like God, it could be a whole thing. So the more intense your illness is, obviously, the more time off you're going to have, or the more time to recovery. And fall, I know, kind of gets a little scary between September and October. You got these goal races coming up. But a lot of times you can recover. You can still get there. Your fitness is built through that training cycle, if not many others. So the race may not be off the table, depending how you're recovering. That's just another, I feel like that's another one that's kind of it's creeping into my athletes right now. There's a few of them that keep getting the little back to school bugs right now, but it's affecting their training, but it hasn't derailed, knock on wood, anyone yet. So
I think this is a kind of a silly thing, but when you have an illness, leaning on your coach for a little bit of support there also. Again, one of the things that I see from runners often is maybe it's even a minor cold and they had to take off their Monday and Tuesday run, and then they want to jump right into their Wednesday workout that might be like an intense interval session or something like that, because they feel like they've lost time and they've got to get the work done. But I think having your coach to help you think through, like, okay, you had a stomach bug and you haven't been able to eat for 2 days. So maybe let's get some food in your system before we go push some intense work. Or, you had a fever and you still can't breathe correctly. We shouldn't be going out for a 20-mile run right now. So helping to settle you down in terms of how you should be returning, even after just a minor cold or something like that. Also helping you rework your plan. So, if you've got a minor cold in the beginning of the week, you might need to adjust the rest of your week. And that's it. You're looking at a 1 week adjustment or flexibility in your schedule, but your coach can help you to dial that in. Okay, here's how we need to restructure this week. By next week, we're going to be right back on track, assuming that you feel okay. But kind of having that guidance both in when and how you should return and how you should restructure when you do.
Yeah, I think too, if right now being almost close to October, I think a lot of the goal races, let's say, for example, maybe November, let's say a sickness, somebody's out for 2 or 3 days, reminding the athlete to look back at the last 6 months that they've done, all the compounding fitness that they've gained, and not even the last 6 months, what have they done prior to that, right? And so reminding an athlete that what's 2, 3, 4 days, what's 1 week, when you compare that to 12 months, 2 years, or even longer of fitness that you've accumulated. I think that's an important topic or point to bring up is to look at that and really put it into perspective of, if you really think that a day or a 2 or a week or sometimes longer is going to derail you, just put it into perspective of how much time you've invested in yourself.
That's a great point, that it's never the current moment is never the full picture. You have such a broad picture of training and fitness, and that's a great point. But I think we tend to hyper focus on the micro, on the thing that's happening right now, and it's so easy when you're the one that's in the thick of the training to forget that big picture. So that's a great point. Look back, look at what you've done before, look at what you've invested leading up to hopefully a minor thing. Okay, so those are health things, injuries, illnesses, but then we've got so much more that can derail training. So let's talk, what other things do you guys see aside from health-related issues? What can get in the way of training otherwise?
So I was thinking about this. I've got a laundry bag literally right next to my chair, and it's got all of the things that I'm currently going through right now, which are what I like to call environmental. Whether that be outside, it may be family, it could be job, it could be, fill in the blank. I've got everything in my bag right here. But let's start with, we've had a weather this weekend. I'm sure people had races that got canceled. So what happens when a race gets canceled, or what happens when, the weather just impacts it, right? And so what do you do then? I think maybe that's a simple place to start. It impacted me. This weekend, I literally, that with other commitments that came up, my training this weekend was completely derailed. It looked completely different than what was on paper. I still got some miles in. I recouped from it, but it was totally different than what I expected and what I wanted. but I adjusted and made it work.
So that's a great point. Like weather being one thing. So in the Mid-Atlantic, we had some extreme weather this weekend. I would say, you know, normal weather shouldn't interfere with your training in theory. But there's always going to be, there's a snowstorm or an ice storm, or we had a tropical storm here this week. And the way that an athlete needs to adjust is going to be so different to the athlete. For example, I had a couple of my athletes had a race canceled, and they were able to go out and do their own race, their own workout early in the morning before the weather got really bad. They were able to fit that in and get it done. I had other athletes who, like, they don't have treadmill access. The time that they could get out during the day was in the thick of the storm, and it wasn't safe for them to be out in high wind and heavy rain. So we've got to adjust. You know, it's not reasonable for you to get this big hardy workout in. So, you know, is the treadmill an option for you, or do we need to look at a different day? Can we flex to Friday, flex to Monday? You know, it doesn't need to be, we have your Saturday long run every single week. We can adjust it this week. We can pick a different day. We can dial the mileage down. And depending on the person too, you know, there are some people that, as long as it was safe, I encouraged them to get out this weekend because they'd never run in the rain before. And I think that's an important experience, because when you get to race day, you want to know, if it's raining, what to wear and how to prepare, and, you know, mentally how to go into something like that. And then there are other people that I said, oh my gosh, you've run in the rain for the past 3 weekends in a row. Let's give you a break and hit the treadmill or adjust it to a different day. The way you approach something as simple as the weather is really going to be different based on the person. What else? So, I mean, weather's an obvious one. This is an outdoor sport. So, you know, of course, that's going to have an effect. But I mean, scheduling, like families, kids, work.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you right now, I mean, with the weather, right, it not only derailed training, but it derailed my kids and my family's plans. A lot of their activities are canceled if it's raining, right? And so then there's a whole different dynamic. So I think talking about, you know, family, and talking about outside commitments that you may have, personal commitments that may interfere. And when I say interfere, that may sound a little negative, but when there's commitments that come up, right, that may derail that day's training. You know, it happened for me this weekend. Unfortunately, it was a little bit too short of notice for me to say, hey, can I just push this back? But I think if you're an athlete and you know that's coming, you know there's a commitment that may derail your day, your week, or even your month, you know, bringing that up and discussing. There's been countless times that I've flipped an athlete's long run from a Saturday to a Sunday, or from a Saturday to a Friday. You know, that's very typical. Or maybe putting in maybe some rest time a little bit more forward, right? And then pushing their workout out a little bit more. So I think when we talk about the family or the personal or outside commitments, yeah, I think we should look at that as, can we plan? Number one, can we plan for that? And if we can't, then how do we rebound, pivot on the fly, and make the most of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think as far as the three of us go, we're all working parents, and most of our athletes are in the same boat. They're, you know, they either work full time or they have kids. And there's the planned absences, but there's also those unplanned ones that very often come up, like a kid's sick, or, you know, some schedule got changed last minute, or, you know, the laundry machine broke. Like, there's all these things that happen, and they do affect your running. And that's, you know, none of us are elite athletes, unfortunately, as much as we might want to be. So our families come first. And I think having a coach is great, because when there's last minute things come up that we can't plan for, you know, the day of, you missed your speed workout, you missed your long run, and you can't do it this weekend at all, we're able to adjust quickly, on the fly, in the moment. Like, it happens. Things happen. They're going to keep happening. And there's going to be days you can't even plan to not run. You just think you're going to run after work, and stuff happens, and we can roll with it. 90% of the time, it's easy to fix. But it happens. And that's why you have coaches and people who can help you adjust the plan. Because I think a common mistake I've seen is, when I don't know that happens with my own athletes, they'll push all their workouts into the rest of their week. They may have 3 days left, so they're going to do their speed workout, their recovery run, their long run, all back to back. And that's not going to help anything. It's just going to add more stress to their bodies and their brains. So there's appropriate ways to rebound from that depending on what you're training for and what your schedule is that week.
That is an excellent point. And if you hadn't just brought it up, I was going to bring it up, is talking to your coach in the moment when things come up on the fly, so that you're adjusting your week, the micro on the fly, you're adjusting it in an appropriate way. You're not, like you said, pushing it all to the end of the week, or at the end of the week, your coach goes into your training log and you haven't done anything because something came up and either you were sick and you couldn't run, or maybe what I also see is you couldn't do it perfectly, so you didn't do it at all. Whereas, maybe we could have had a conversation of, I don't have time for 6 miles, but I do have time for 3 miles. And so, let's look at what you can do. Let's look at something better than nothing. But what about like even on a macro scale? Let's say you decided in March that you wanted to do a big thing. You committed to a marathon or an ultra marathon, and you have this dream that you are invested in. But as you're getting into your training, like stuff comes up on a large scale, right? That like you have a big work project that came up, or you have to move, or your kid is going through something traumatic that you need to invest more of your energy in. Or, I mean, there's countless different things that don't just affect your day to day, but maybe in a larger scale, you're not able to train in the ideal way that you thought you would be able to. Then what?
Yeah, I think that's common. Maybe not as common as injuries or some of the other things we talked about, but I myself have had all of that wrapped up into one right now as we currently speak. So my fall A race is off the table. By choice. It's not an injury. It's not anything like that. But if I look at it, I look at 2022 was a perfect calendar year. It was a perfect season. Every race went great, multiple PRs. Everything was great. 2023, it is a complete 360. Yeah, I've had a new job. I've had family issues. I've had health issues. I've had, some things on my mind mentally that have really just occupied my time. And when I sat back and looked at it, running was not anymore the top focal point for me. It might have been my 5th, which really has never happened in my life. It has never been that far down. So I found myself not necessarily missing workouts or missing runs, but not enjoying it and really questioning, is this the right time to tackle this? Because maybe if I look at the course of the 6-month training block that I've been in, I've missed too many key workouts, or I've had to scale them back too much, which is okay. In the moment, that was okay. But looking at it in a grand picture, should I readjust my goals? And if anybody else out there as an athlete has gone through that, it's hard. It really is, but it's okay. It's how can we look at it and say, how do we make the most of it? Right now, for me, I did not want to run my goal race because of reasons. I just didn't want to do it. But I think if an athlete really wants to do it, and we look at it and say, there's been so many things just thrown at your plate and hitting you upside the head so many times, maybe we do have to talk about shifting a little bit, pivoting, and saying, are you really going to enjoy that goal race, right? Considering everything that's going on in your life and that's happened, and let's talk about that, but then let's also talk about what's next, right? Because I think one goes with the other. Is you've got to deal with the current situation, but what happens after that? For me, I know things are going to get better. I've got goals beyond that. But I think for me, I wanted to bring up my example because I think I've got all of that wrapped up into one. And I think it does paint a picture of things can be great one day and not so good the next day, and sometimes it's hard.
Yeah, and there's times where like maybe your goal race isn't happening. Like you have a marathon planned at the end of October and something happens where that's not going to happen. It doesn't mean you don't do your goal. You can't hit a goal. You just need to shift it to maybe there's another marathon if that's what you're training for, or we can downgrade to a half marathon and try to go for a faster half marathon. There's always a backup plan where you don't have to stop running. Like running doesn't have to be off the table. You can adjust based on your availability and your, whether it's illness or mental health stresses or whatever else. You can always find another goal. It may not be the same distance, but there's always some way we can find another thing to work towards. And I think that is important. A lot of us have very type A personalities and need something on the calendar to work towards. I know I'm that kind of person, So just adding something on the calendar, I think, can help remotivate you, even if it's not the original goal.
I think that's huge. And I think we've talked about that on this podcast before, that changing your mind is acceptable. It's even admirable, maybe, if the thing that you originally set out to do isn't serving you as you start that path toward it. It is completely acceptable and reasonable to change your mind, whether that's the goal entirely and you decide that you need to change the goal that you're chasing, or the method by which we approach it, that, this is the ideal training that we had in mind. Maybe that's not actually fitting into your life as we're 8 weeks into it, or your body. Maybe it's not serving your body 8 weeks into it. And so we need to adjust the method, that we're still chasing the same goal, but the way that we do that has got to change to fit into your schedule, fit into your life. I think I've already said it 2 or 3 times on this podcast alone, that we spend a lot of time training. Training is where your life is. The goal you're working toward is a single day, one day out of months that are leading up to it. And so you have to make the training fit and work with what you're living in. You can't just continue to force it and plow forward if it's not working, whether that's, again, a physical issue or a mental, emotional schedule, stress thing that's going on. So it's important, again, to be honest with yourself, and also to be honest and open with your coach about how training is fitting into your life, and if it's serving you, and to have those conversations about changing what you're working toward or the method by which you're working toward it.
Mm-hmm. Do you have you seen, and I think I know the answer to this, but have you seen where just knowing your athlete, right, whether it be having worked with them for multiple goal races, asking them the questions here and there, how you feeling, what's going on, oh, my leg hurts a little bit, okay, we can work through it, etc. How do you feel that makes that conversation easier for both you and the athlete, coach and athlete, where if something done catastrophic, let's say, like, oh my gosh, I can't run JFK this year, right? Like, a little bit easier pill to swallow because you've got a better relationship because of that time that you've invested, coach-athlete relationship.
100%. I'm so glad that you asked. And I want to sort of emphasize this point. I hate to use this podcast to promote ourselves, but it's important to More Miles and the culture that we are coaching by, that we really want to promote long-term coach-athlete relationships. We set our pricing in a way that makes it affordable for people to have a long-term coach-athlete relationship. That's why I think it's so important that you get to know someone really well over one training cycle, right? It's a lot of days, it's a lot of time, but for as well as you get to know someone in one training cycle, how well do you get to know that person over multiple training cycles, over multiple years? And that's a huge point, that when you have really gotten to know somebody, both in the personal sense and also gotten to know their body, you've gotten to know how they react. We've tried training this way and it worked really well for you. We've tried training this way, it didn't work for you. Like, we've figured out the best way that you respond. But you also, you kind of learn when to push and when to pull back. And you have to kind of know somebody to understand what the right call is. Is this person just having a hard moment? Are they just tired and we need to keep pushing through to get to that next level? Or is this person really overwhelmed and we have got to pull back? This is not working for them. We've got to change and adjust. And sometimes you really can only tell that difference when you've worked through problems before with a person. So I think long-term relationships are so, so important. Your coach can be a better coach for you the longer that they've worked for you, because they've gotten to know your body responses. They've gotten to know your patterns, your emotional responses, and they understand for you when to push you forward and when to pull you back. And I think that's huge, is the longer you've gotten to know somebody. Yeah, I'm glad you asked. Other things that can derail, I just a couple other items here that are things that I see are overtraining or undertraining. And I think that kind of comes back to the conversation we just had about figuring out how training fits into your life. Are you pushing yourself too hard, that your body's not responding well, that you're doing too much? Or are we not getting enough done? Are there too many missed days, too many missed workouts, that the training we have on your calendar is not actually getting done or isn't working for you or fitting into your schedule? Do you guys see either, probably both, either of those, that you maybe need to adjust what someone's goal is or adjust the style of their training because of overworking or underworking?
Yeah, so I've had both. I've had athletes who, we built up to 5 or 6 days a week, and with their life and their whatever, they weren't able to get them in, or they were starting, you could see the paces start to increase slowly. Maybe they weren't saying anything, but I'm like, oh, this is kind of crazy. Like, your paces are going up by a minute or two consistently. It's not hot out. Like, what's going on? And when you check in, they're tired. So we need to adjust. They're overtraining. So let's back off to 4 days a week. So you have that mental stress and physical stress lessened a little bit. And then they usually wind up thriving. And I have other athletes where I have logged in and been like, oh man, like, what's going on this week? We've hit 1 out of 5 workouts. And when you reach out, it's like they just needed that motivator. I think sometimes you just need the coach to come in and say, like, hey, what's up? And all of a sudden they're like, oh shoot, they're watching. You need the accountability almost to get back into that training. Like, we're getting close to marathon day. These workouts aren't going to do themselves. So,
yeah. I think too, from an overtraining standpoint, one thing that I see is, aside from just not doing a workout, right? Or doing more workouts than what's prescribed, right? So for example, if there's a scheduled rest day and an athlete is feeling fantastic, they're on a roll, they've been hitting workouts left and right, and they just want to go out for that 4-mile easy run on that rest day, that's overtraining. There's a reason there's a rest day there. But then also, with a little bit more detail on that is, I do see plenty of times where a pace will be prescribed, right? Whether it's, hey, today's heart rate training, if you're going to be in a math zone, whatever it may be, or it may be, hey, I'm going to give you some pace work, right? Some speed work. And you see the athlete go faster than that, right? So as a coach, the question has to be, well, wow, that's fantastic. You're moving. What happened? How are you feeling, right? And so sometimes the pace may be a little bit too quick, right? And so there's a method there in terms of like kind of balancing it out, right? Is if you're rolling the hot hand and you want to keep running fast, but at the same time, you got to slow yourself down sometimes. So I see that a bit is where people feel really good and get very anxious. So that's great. Let's keep moving. But there may be a time to dial it back just a little bit, right? Especially if you're way far out from a goal rate, depending on what your goal is, or your goal may be adjusted. If something's going really well like that and you're hitting your paces that much faster, maybe it's time to talk about, hey, what is your goal really? Is your goal just to finish, or should your goal be up here? You know what I mean? So I think as a coach, I can see some of those things, see some of those data markers for somebody that's overtraining. And I'm using overtraining in an example of in a good way, right? They're moving very well and maybe progressing faster. And having that conversation of, do we need to rediscuss what your goal is?
So I have a question for you guys, whether for yourselves or for athletes that you've worked with. We keep kind of throwing around the term overtraining. So I want to talk about that for a second. I think probably the biggest question that people listening to this might have is, how do you know the difference between overtraining and normal fatigue? Because this is a thing that we usually see in the peak of a training cycle. Someone is in, maybe their peak 3 or 4 weeks of training. It's a heavy load. They're doing a lot of training. So for yourselves or for athletes that you coach, how do you know the difference between fatigue that is productive and fatigue that is breaking you down?
Yeah, so I think it depends. I mean, it's different. Again, it's different for each person. So it's hard to give, there's basic metrics, but it's going to be a little different for each person. I think sleep changes can be a huge sign. Like, if you're not sleeping well, all of a sudden, that might be a sign of overtraining. Your heart rate is suddenly changing, either resting heart rate or during your training runs. Like, if you can't get your training run in, your heart into MAF zone, I think that's a big red flag right there, where it's really hard for you to stay there without walking a lot, where you normally run, or you can't even get out the door. Like, mentally, you start to burn out. There's also the mental side of overtraining, where it's hard to get yourself out the door. The motivation's gone. So those are kind of big red flags that I've experienced myself, as well as seen in others. there's overreaching, which is when you're just kind of tired and your legs are sore and, you know, I want to go to bed and sleep really well, and that's fine. But when you get past that point where it starts affecting your recovery, it starts affecting your mental state, that's where you need to start kind of looking into things.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would say that if an athlete is hitting all of their workouts, they're putting in the work, they're putting in the miles as prescribed, and they're continually, tired in the sense of you keep hearing the same narrative, right? Like, oh my gosh, I'm just exhausted. My heart rate, I can't get it down on my math. Fill in the blank. I think that is a really big sign, of overtraining versus, if somebody is just, they've got the motivation, right? They're like, hey, I feel great, but my legs are a little bit sore. You just were in the peak week in terms of your mileage. So they're probably going to be a little bit sore the next day. I think that's a really key point is some of those indicators, Michelle, that you just mentioned.
Yeah, I think these small injuries, like the other thing is small injuries. I hadn't even thought of that. When you get a bunch of little small nagging injuries, not soreness, not tightness, you start to get this little, like Lauren calls them niggles, those little things that just don't go away. That can be another sign too, because you're not recovering. Like maybe you don't notice you're not recovering, but your body's not recovering. It's not repairing itself properly. So you start getting these other injuries that otherwise may not appear.
And probably
go ahead.
I was just going to say one huge thing, the mental side of it, Michelle, that you mentioned is if somebody loses the fire altogether, just like, I don't even want to run today, okay, well, that may be a bigger sign. So,
yeah.
I think you both hit the nail on the head with that point. And that is my number one indicator of the difference between productive fatigue and over fatigue is the mental piece, the motivation that a lot of times when people are productively fatigued, their running is so routine. They're tired, they're whooped, but they are still going out the door every day on their schedule, like normal, even though they're tired. And the motivation, I just don't want to go run today. I just can't do it. That is almost always the first sign of overtraining. Before you start to see the physical responses, you see the mental response first. But let's dive in for a quick second there. So overtraining is, again, sort of the broad term that gets thrown around. More often than not, what it really is under recovering. So let's talk a little bit about how we address that. Let's say that really is the issue that you're in. What do we do? So under recovering, I want to make clear, because I think this is, again, the fear for a lot of people when they hear the word overtraining is I'm going to have my training taken away. I'm going to have to cut my miles. I'm going to have to decrease the load that I'm doing. Sometimes, yes, that is the solution. Sometimes we really just need to dial into your recovery and find what you're missing on the recovery piece. Is it because you don't have enough time to recover, in which case we do need to dial down your total load, your total volume? Or is it something else? Is it that you're not fueling adequately and not getting the calories and the macros in your body that you need to sustain the training? Is it that your intensity is too high? Maybe it's not the mileage, but the frequency of intensity is too much. Is it sleep? Is it life stress? So what do when we do have someone who is overtrained or under recovering, what are the ways that we can pull them out of that and not just cut down, okay, we've got to take a whole week of rest or 2 weeks of rest or whatever? What methods do we have to work out of that?
Okay, so,
I think first,
go ahead.
and now you go ahead, Michelle. You go.
So first thing is usually dialing back the intensity. Like we can give a couple recovery runs in a row or take a day off. But I like to talk to them and see what their life is like. Really kind of dive into the outside sources. Like, are you sleeping? Like, because that is a really big one for a lot of people, is they're not getting enough sleep, and it's super important. So, make sure we give them the time to, like you said, dial back so they can sleep in. So if they're getting up at 4:30 to do their runs, we might need to shorten the weekday runs a little bit so they can sleep till 5:30. We always talk about nutrition, but I think that's a huge key piece of recovery is making sure you're getting the nutrients to recover so your body can heal. It doesn't become injured, doesn't become fatigued. So I kind of try to dive into the other 22 hours of their day when they're not running, because I think a lot of fixes can happen there before we have to dial back an entire training plan. Focusing on that mental health, even just taking 10 minutes to listen to music or meditate can help immensely. So I don't always go to running as the place to dial back. It might be some other part of their life that needs to dial back, or if they're going to the gym on top of their runs. I mean, as the running coach, I'm kind of like, let's let those workouts drop first so you can focus on your running during peak training, and then you can come back to that later on.
100%. So looking at the other hours of the day as the key there, I completely agree. And to your point about like strength training, it might be a matter of just restructuring when you're doing it. It might not even be like you need to stop going to the gym or cut back on the gym. It might be that you're loading it in such a way that your body's not getting a recovery day in there. We've got to just change the schedule of when you're doing the extra work, whether it's strength training or cross training or what have you, to make sure that you're getting a adequate recovery time in there, and we're not just damaging your muscles. And then the nutrition piece, huge, especially for your athletes who are training 5, 6, or 7 days a week. If you are training most days of the week, your nutrition off the run is a huge component in your recovery. You have got to be getting adequate protein. You have got to be getting adequate carbohydrates, because every time you go out the door, you are depleting your energy sources. You're doing damage to your muscles. You're depleting your carbohydrate storage. And if you're not replenishing your muscles with protein, replenishing your energy sources with carbohydrates, you eventually can't go again the next day. If you're undercutting, it might work for you for a little while, but eventually you can't keep going the next day. So those athletes who are training most days of the week, which I would say is a 5, 6, or 7 days a week, your nutrition is key, especially for those 8 to 10 weeks leading up to your goal race, when you are really in a heavy volume training mode. So yes, I completely agree with looking at what you're doing off the run first. Scott, you looked like you had something to add there, but I might have just kept talking right over you.
No, I think that covers literally everything. Like, that covers it at the high level. The one thing that I do look at a lot is I take a look at that rest day. So I really stress full rest on rest day, and having the conversation of, well, what are you really doing on your rest day, right? Maybe it's not, I'm going to the gym and I'm lifting because I like to lift, or I'm taking this class because I like to take this class. Maybe it's they've got a part-time job and it's a manual labor job. Maybe it's, something else. Maybe it's like, oh my gosh, that's my one day off. I'm going to pick up an extra shift at work, right? And so there could be numerous things that go into that. And so I'm not ever trying to dissuade somebody from doing that, but I always try to dig in and what does your rest day really look like? Let's not talk about the running. Let's talk about everything else. So, but again, it goes to that, what are you doing with the other 23 hours of your day?
I think that circles back to also your training, excuse me, your training may look different year to year, cycle to cycle. I think there are athletes who maybe last year or the year before that could get away with a 7-day running week, or on their rest day, they would run 1 mile or 2 miles or 3 miles as active recovery. And that might have worked at one point, and it's not working now. And so you've got to take a routine that you've had for several seasons or for several years and make a change. And that's okay. Like, I am that person. I used to, my 7th day of running was anywhere from 3 to 8 miles, depending on what I was training for, at a low intensity. But my rest day was never rest. It was always a light run. It was active recovery. And that did work really well for me to move my body a little bit on that rest day. I'm now in a different spot. I'm training in a different way. I'm a little bit older. My life schedule is a little bit different. And at this point, I take a true rest day. I'm a 6-day-a-week runner, not a 7-day-a-week runner. And I'm training better. I'm seeing better results for that, but it's different. It's a change. So, knowing, again, training has to adjust with you, with your life, and what you've done before might not work for you now. And what you did for this distance in this race might not work for this distance in this race. So knowing that training is fluid. It is not a concrete plan. It should never be a concrete plan in a single training cycle or, over the course of multiple cycles, multiple years.
I think that's
Okay.
important. Like it's interesting because I'm in a spot where I've never taken really a lot true rest days. It's always been let me take a long walk or just go to yoga class or take bikes. Like I'm not a person who likes to sit very well. And I think I'm in a cycle now where it's the first time I've been forced to take rest, like an entire, I hate to say it's an entire day or two off, which is, I'll admit, it's a very anxiety inducing to do that for me, but it is changing the game. And it's, as we get older, we need that extra time to rest. And I don't like to admit it when someone calls you a master's runner and you're like, no, it's not cool. Like, I don't like that
Embrace the
term.
masters. Some
I
of
know,
us have been in the masters class for
Masters.
quite a while. Come on.
I don't like it, but it is a point where I have to face the music and say, it's time to change. It's not, I can't do that. It's not sustainable for me. And it's going to be okay. It's hard. It's hard to make that admission to yourself.
Seriously though, take that term for a minute, as I'm still like 8 months away from the master's category. But look at that. Masters as in mastery, right? I mean, seriously, you have gotten to a point that you know yourself better. A lot of people, not all, some people are starting running in their 40s, in their 50s, in their 60s. But if you have been running for a while and you get to the master's age group and things start to change, you have that mastery of yourself and of the sport that you are learning how to make those adjustments, and that it's okay to make those adjustments. And if you approach it that way, that's how you get faster as a master. It's not in resisting the change and changes that come with it. It's acknowledging them, understanding them, and rolling with them. That's what makes you a master of the sport. Like I almost kind of, talking about, like the love of the process, like mastery is what we're all chasing, right? Is mastering the craft or the hobby that we do. And so I think you can shift it that way a little bit, that's what it's referencing, right? Is not like old folks, it's referencing mastery.
You just had to turn 40 to master the sport. That's all you had to do. It's amazing.
Yeah. What about, and this thought just came to mind, and when Lauren, you were talking about 6 days a week versus 7 days a week. The athlete that's brand new to running and doesn't know that 6 or 7 days a week is probably not ideal for them. So I think less is more for a newer athlete. Somebody that comes and says, hey, I've never run, or I've took a break for 10 years, right? I've done that before. And may have this mindset and this idea, like, I have to run every day to get better. When the reality is maybe they're only running 3 days a week or 2 days a week or 4, right? And so for that newer athlete, not from an age perspective newer, but just from somebody that hasn't run that much and maybe is just new to the sport or the activity, is taking it a little bit slower, right? Because if that athlete does run 6 or 7 days a week, there is a higher likelihood that they're going to get injured. So I think that's one thing to make note if anybody's listening that may want to get into running. We're not saying it's 6 to 7 days a week for every single athlete. So just thought I'd bring that up.
That's an excellent point, and I'm glad that you did. Right, you can always start. You can always add, right? So start with 3 days a week where you've got plenty of recovery time in between. If that feels good, you can always add more. You can always build upon that. But if you overdo, it's a lot harder then to correct. Then you're looking into injuries, over fatigue, that sort of thing. So yeah, you're right. If you're new or if you're training for a shorter distance, these big numbers that I'm throwing out there are not the starting point. They are we've been multiple training cycles, multiple years working toward that level. A high volume runner that's never where you start. It's a years long process to get to be a high volume athlete. And it's not for everybody, to be clear. Even if you've been training for years, high volume is relative to the person. You might see an elite runner putting in 130, 140 miles a week regularly, whereas your 40 miles a week is high volume for a typical person. That's a lot of time. So understanding what it's all relative to you, and it's really important that it is. And I think that almost kind of wraps up our discussion, that this is why we believe, and I think it is so important to work with a coach, to have somebody who is an expert in the thing that you are wanting to work toward, and someone who is a third party outside of your head that can give you the, not just the knowledge, but also just the perspective, and can support you, guide you, help you along the way, and help you to figure out what is the best path for you in a grander sense, in a micro sense, just the whole journey along the way. Is there anything that you guys would add?
No, I think
No.
that's perfectly put.
Yeah.
All right. Well, hopefully, coming back to the beginning, when shit hits the fan, hopefully this is a helpful reference for inevitably when things don't go perfectly, to help you understand what kind of things are normal along the way, and how to address, how to react to those kinds of things. If you have questions, or if this is something we can help you with, if you find yourself in one of those injury, illness, the training you're doing is not working for you cycles, please reach out to us. You can find our website is moremilestogo.com, and you can find contact information for all three of us there, either individually, or you can reach out to find out who would be the best coach for you to talk to. You can also find our podcast. The More Miles podcast is now available wherever you listen to podcasts. It is on every platform. So we're not just Spotify. You can also find us on Amazon, Audible, Google, Apple. I think that's it off the top of my head. Those are all the big ones. And of course, YouTube. YouTube is where you can actually watch our conversation and listen in there as well. We've also got extended content on YouTube. So we have several episodes there prior to when we started the podcast. Okay, hopefully this was a helpful conversation. Thank you guys so much. And we'll be back actually next week with another guest interview. So look for another episode coming out in just 1 week as opposed to every other week for this time. Okay, you guys have a good night. Thank you for being here.
Night.
Yeah, bye.